I've been asked to talk briefly about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and about the emergence recently of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Let me start with the impetus for the humanitarian initiative. The unacceptable humanitarian harm caused by nuclear weapons has been evident ever since the first use of such armaments on Hiroshima and Nagasaki nearly 75 years ago. Yet calls for the abolition of nuclear arsenals struggled for many years to gain attention. Eventually, the success of advocates of prohibiting other weapons, for example anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, helped inspire a deepening of the campaign against nuclear weapons, centred upon the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of their use. This was achieved by drawing attention to the physical effects of those arms on humans ahead of their perceived strategic and military utility. In a sense, this moved the burden of proof from an emphasis on military advantage to an emphasis on humanitarian impacts. Of course, in the case of nuclear weapons, this is a more complicated equation. The possessors attribute a positive global security dimension to nuclear weapons, while many other states regard the existence of such arms negatively, as detracting from global security rather than underwriting it. In 2010, the Review Conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, expressed its deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. It also reaffirmed the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. This consensus expression of the NPT parties motivated a series of evidence-collecting conferences in Norway, Mexico and Austria in 2013 and 2014. The evidence that was gathered covered the impacts and risks surrounding nuclear weapons and the impracticality of equipping the world with international relief resources sufficient for mitigating the aftermath of the detonation of nuclear arms. These findings led to the negotiation in the United Nations in 2017 of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, the TPNW. Now, the impetus for the TPNW stemmed from several elements. The treaty itself was adopted by 122 states in the United Nations General Assembly in July 2017. And it developed out of, firstly, a resurgence of concern about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, including, as I've just mentioned, the 2010 NPT Review Conference expression of deep concern. And secondly, frustration on the part of many non-nuclear members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty about the slow pace of nuclear disarmament. But the conclusion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was not only a result of frustration and deep humanitarian concern. It was also a sign of the continued belief by a majority of states in the power of legal norms and customary international law relating to developing effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, to quote a legally binding obligation from the NPT. Most non-nuclear weapon states argued that while they had kept their side of the bargain in not acquiring nuclear weapons, the 5 NPT recognised nuclear armed states, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom and the United States, were showing few signs of sustained moves towards nuclear disarmament as required by the NPT. Some non-nuclear weapon states, i.e. those in nuclear alliances with possessing states, advocate the elimination of nuclear weapons, but for the meantime are content to derive their security under the nuclear weapon umbrella of extended deterrence. For many non-nuclear weapon states, these realities were compounded by the fact that nuclear weapon states far from moving steadily towards effective measures on nuclear disarmament, were actually engaged in modernising their existing arsenals, and even in some instances developing new kinds of such weapons. In other words, they were perceived as moving in the opposite direction from their NPT obligations, as well as commitments previously undertaken at NPT review conferences. Another factor was that non-nuclear United Nations member states in the Middle East were particularly concerned that the consensus decision of the 2010 NPT review conference to convene a meeting to establish a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in that region was continually being postponed. The 2015 NPT review conference's efforts to agree on a final document founded on disagreement over this factor. Moreover, in an unstable and deteriorating global security environment, international concern was intensified by an increasing awareness that the risks of a nuclear detonation, accidental or deliberate, were not zero, and that any hostilities involving the current 9 nuclear armed states, that is, the NPT recognised 5, plus non-NPT parties, India, Israel, which is widely assumed to have nuclear arms, North Korea, and Pakistan, would create catastrophic impacts for all countries. Everyone thus is seen as having a vested interest in preventing nuclear conflict and in the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons. This was a central message of global advocacy networks, notably the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, in championing the TPNW as an effective measure toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. The goals of the TPNW are evident in both the treaty's preamble and in its opening article. The preamble notes how these aims are consistent with and help to implement a number of other wider United Nations aims, including the UN General Assembly resolutions calling for nuclear weapon elimination and the need for compliance with international humanitarian law. Article 1 prohibits not only nuclear weapon possession by any party, but also the receiving, transfer or control of nuclear weapons, or the stationing of nuclear weapons in any other country, or assisting or encouraging any other country in nuclear weapon activities. In essence, the TPNW's provisions are aimed at, firstly, universally applying international humanitarian law against indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks on populations as a consequence of nuclear weapons use, and secondly, seeking to reinforce an NPT objective of preventing nuclear proliferation, that is, to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, the current policy of members of nuclear alliances and some individual states is to depend for their security on nuclear weapons via the doctrine of deterrence and by extended deterrence as provided by possessor states. Such a reliance is increasingly seen as complicating efforts both to facilitate nuclear disarmament and to discourage proliferation. The notion of nuclear weapons as providers of security runs counter to efforts to eliminate them under the NPT. As the TPNW is still 15 countries away from entering into force, its full impact remains to be seen. The new treaty can be said, however, to have already intensified the debate about the continued existence and potential use of nuclear weapons and whether or not they have a role in underpinning global or regional security or, on the contrary, undermining it. I've also been asked just to make a short comment about the roles of governments, international organisations and civil society in this complicated situation. We already know about the dreadful impacts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We also know of the huge damage inflicted by civil nuclear explosions, as at Chernobyl and Fukushima. The explosion of a nuclear weapon, whether accidental or deliberate, would likely be many times greater than either of those civil accidents. It would greatly compound our concerns about climate change. Governments, international organisations and civil society need to join hands in making these consequences universally understood. Thank you.